person for learning. Okay, so let's get to our speakers. We're joined today by NLI's Senior Vice President of Client Experience and Product. She's accountable for how much our work creates real habits out there in organizations. Catherine Milan. Hi, Catherine. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Gabe. Glad to be joining from this Salvador Dali painting.
Oh, looks nice. And today's session will be facilitated by the guy that let the NLI staff work and learn virtually since I started here 7 years ago. So he's been pretty progressive about the world of virtual work and learning before the world was really ready to embrace it like it is now. Our CEO and co-founder, Dr. David Rock. Hello, David.
Thanks very much, Gabe. Thanks for your warm welcome and doing all the hard work behind the scenes. And Catherine, delighted to have you here with us. Thanks for making time in your busy schedule and all the incredible client work. But it's great to have you up front. You're often behind the scenes, just making everything really work. I know you're super passionate about literally the impact of our work on habits, and we'll talk more about that and how we track habits and how we build those. But thanks for an incredible 5 years with us so far. You know, building this from a small team here to really some incredible work we're doing. Thanks for everything you're doing. I want to, for those of you new to the organization, I see we've got about 250 or so people. Our vision is making organizations more human through science. It's almost like we wrote that for 2020, but we didn't. It's a few years old. We're about using science to make companies better, but by actually increasing really the way they deal with humans from a science perspective. So really understanding how we thrive, what makes us really thrive, and following the science at every level. We've published over 50 peer-reviewed academic research papers. We're scientists at the core, but over the last 15, 20 years, we've actually been advising over 50 of the Fortune 100 as well. And now the impact of the work is at the scale of millions of people a year, which we're very excited about. We've been in the learning space a long time. 2008 was the first time that we published anything on learning. And I'll just give you a quick walkthrough kind of how we've been thinking about learning. It's been a topic that's been really, really important to us right from the start. So 2008, we published a piece on how insight actually happens in the brain. And I had a really, really strong hypothesis, actually from even years before that insight was the active ingredient in learning, that it literally changes the brain in ways that never goes back. But we looked in 2008 kind of how it works. 2010, we published a big piece that's now 10 years old, standing the test of time. It's really organizing all of learning into one framework that gives you a set of principles. And we'll dig into that today a little bit. 2014, we came back to AGES to say what really matters most. And one of the things that we saw in there was the power of social learning and the importance of that. And I'll dig further into that with Catherine today. 2015, we finally published 7 years later, something I'd been dying to publish forever, which was why insight actually changes the brain and how it actually works and why it's such an important ingredient in learning. I mean, if you're in learning, if you're in designing or delivering learning, you are an insight architect or an insight facilitator. And when you start thinking that way, it actually changes everything. It's a really powerful way to think about learning overall. And then finally, we published a really important piece recently on coherence, which is the structural integrity of ideas. So there's actually a science to how you design any kind of learning or change experience such that it has maximum structural integrity or coherence. There's both a science and practice of that. And there's a really fascinating body of work that emerged out of that paper. And then we're assessing coherence across organizations and all sorts of fun things. So we published 5 pieces. That's kind of the tip of the iceberg. There's also many other pieces in industry research and all sorts of other stuff. But for us, learning is the kind of the mechanism of activating habits. Ultimately, we're in the habit activation business at scale, not the training or learning business. We're in the business of activating habits at scale, but the mechanism is some kind of learning experience. And for us, that's it's amazing to follow the science. And that's what we'll talk about a little bit more today. Let's actually do a little level setting. We've got a poll for you. We can launch that poll. Curious about kind of what's happened for you around learning. So since the start of COVID, I guess March roughly, did learning go on hold? It went virtual, but the impact decreased, or it went virtual, it's about the same, or it went virtual and you're getting better results. Really curious to see are you curious, Catherine? I'm so curious to see what this number is.
Yeah, I'm especially curious to see what we're seeing from these folks because I know we have a lot of anecdotal evidence. So it'll be interesting to see how that matches up with what we're seeing in the poll.
Got about 160 so far of 280. So let's get a few more people in the poll. Love to get above 200. Really curious. We've got 60% of you voted so far. Let's get a few more. You can put stuff in the chat. We'd rather you actually answer in the poll, by the way. So if you have put something in the chat, sometimes you got to kind of move windows around to find the poll. That's usually why people can't do it. But if you absolutely can't find it, throw it in the chat. Just throw one of these things in the chat. We'll pull the data in later. Let's see, we're at 200 and something. So we'll close that off in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, let's have a look at the data there. So what we have is 7% only got on hold. That's good. That's good to see. 24%, a quarter went virtual, but it got worse. 40% went virtual, it's about the same. Interesting, although the mechanisms for actually knowing that for sure are going to be not that great, I think, if you're not actually testing real habit activation. You might just be testing, do people like it and do they turn up, but not has it actually given people new habits. And a quarter gone virtual, but getting better results. Okay, well, Catherine, any comments on that from your perspective?
Yeah, I think that the analysis of the data that we're looking at is going to be really interesting. I saw some folks putting in the chat that we've gone virtual, but we're unclear on what the results are. We're not sure how we're evaluating that. So I'm looking forward to digging into that in the session.
Yeah, no, we'll talk about that more. I mean, from our perspective, going virtual, 100% of your learning can be better. 100% of what you're doing can be better. And it makes absolutely no sense unless you actually start with the science. It doesn't require any high tech. It does require a video platform of some sort. So it could be Zoom, could be Teams, could be, WebEx, could be Google Hangout, which I think is free. But you do want to see, it is important you can see people and that you can interact with chat. Those things are really important. If you can't see people in virtual learning, it's going to be really, really difficult. But lots of different platforms out there. This is platform agnostic. We don't care what tech you're using. What this is about is actually following the science of learning. And completely throwing out everything that we know about learning in the classroom and literally just starting with the science and inventing from there. And that's what we've been doing actually for a long time. In fact, about 7 years ago, we said, we're going to get out of the workshop business completely. We're going to shrink it down radically, and virtual is so much better that it's actually going to be 100% of our business. And actually before COVID, it was like 80% in that area.
89, yeah.
89% pre-COVID of our work, our behavior change work was virtual. 89, wow. And obviously now it's 100. But you just follow the science is the cliff note. So we're going to talk about 3 things. I'm going to stop and sort of take your comments and questions and look at the chat kind of in between. But put a comment in the chat anytime. But I'm going to kind of, Catherine and I'll sort of look at it a bit more in between. The sections, kind of three kind of chapters, I guess. So first one, and then I'll put a lot of the science in here. There's an opportunity to radically improve all learning. That's the thing. Like pretty much anything that you're teaching can be better in a virtual world. I haven't seen something that actually is better in person unless it involves some kind of physical interaction with some kind of physical, like a machine, or using some kind of you're in a lab or something. You've really got to see people physically, next to you doing something. With the exception of that, everything you're doing, particularly in soft skills, should be better. There's nothing I've seen that actually should be better in workshops, and I'll explain why. Includes leadership development, deeper programs. We'll talk about that second, and then we'll talk about large events briefly as well. But sort of most of this will be up front. I do want to make a distinction. There's when you start thinking about the science, there are 2 kind of broad categories of learning. The technical skills category is kind of things people know they need, like they know they've got a gap in how to use, some new software, right? And they think they'll feel better if they have it, but they know they need it, and they might, procrastinate, but ultimately they know they're going to need to do it, right? Versus most human skills, the more you actually need it, the less you think you need it. And often people, you really, really avoid doing any of that work. So you can sort of think really differently about technical skills and human skills. And I think with technical skills, you've got this broad swathe of options from, self-paced to these, wonderful kind of, internally generated pathways from Degreed and others, to, which is like the playlist things, internally generated. You've got lots of different ways of doing technical skills. Because people do tend to self-serve, but there's a long history and a lot of research showing people do not self-serve well on the human skills. So you actually have to think about this differently. And from our perspective, there's, the human skills should be, super efficient. And also we're now experimenting with kind of event-driven learning just as something's happening, actually giving people the exact powerful, very quick tool, like at a glance, to make them better just as they're doing something. So either very efficient ahead of time or super efficient in real time. That's the world of human skills, and we're starting to cover both. So we're going to talk about human skills. I'm not really going to talk about technical skills today. Do you want to walk us through this, Catherine? This is ridiculous data, but give us a little bit of the background of this, what the number is. Tell us about what this slide says.
Yeah. And one thing I just want to make very clear, because I'm seeing some of the questions come up in comments in the chat. So in terms of virtual learning, that can mean a lot of things for us. So that can be a blend of asynchronous learning, self-paced learning with a social component layered in. It could be virtual instructor-led training. And the great thing about that is that it does offer a lot of variety that we'll all see kind of strong results coming from. What we're looking at here is a comparison that we did. So this is a clear breakdown of one of our clients who rolled out Decide, which is our unconscious bias solution. They ran several hundred sessions with several thousand people through this program. And we were able to compare then the folks who went through the workshop versus the folks who went through our distributed learning solution, or DLS, which is 3 weeks of self-paced content, and then capping it off with a interactive live webinar in week 4. And what we see here is what we call BCP. So we're looking at behavior change percentage. Training is really only worth it if people actually go out and do something differently as a result of that training, right? Why are we investing millions of dollars to just hand out smile sheets and see, oh, did you like it? Would you, recommend it to a friend? That's not what's going to actually shift behavior, shift your culture. So one of the questions that we ask in this analysis of Decide and that experience for participants is, how often are you using a strategy to mitigate unconscious bias each week? And what we're looking at here, 59%, which is a good solid number, are using a strategy at least 1 to 3 times a week or more. Those are the folks who went through the workshop. But if you look at that 80%, those are the people who went through the virtual training. 80% of those people are using a strategy once a week or more to mitigate unconscious bias. And if you look at that at the end of the day, that adds up to hundreds of thousands of biases mitigated over the course of a year. Really powerful stuff.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Catherine. And what's important to realize here also is, if you have like even 10,000 employees, right? To put 10,000 employees through workshops just is never going to happen. It's going to cost, many millions of dollars, huge manpower. People are never going to prioritize it. So you're just never going to impact everyone. But actually you could impact the entire 10,000 people literally in 1 month and get the 80% number. It's mad. So, the comparison, with 10,000 people with say, $500,000 with, 10,000 people, you're going to hit a very small number of people and it's not going to be as effective. And for, far less than that, you're going to hit the entire company in a month and then be able to move on. So this is the power of virtual. It's not just about you can scale. It's not just about you can do it faster. It's actually just literally better from the point of the percentage of people activating habits. And I know Catherine and her team have been working on all this year's data from hundreds of different projects. And at our summit coming up, we're going to share out all the new data we've got, comparing like workshop with other things as well. But just to put a point to it, but virtual, because people are asking, virtual for me just means not physically in person. So the way we're defining it, there's I'm sure lots of definitions. We're defining it as there's no in-person in the same room experience. It might be a Zoom experience, it might, sort of, platform like that. It might be sharing stuff out virtually, but, sharing content out, all of that. But there's a particular quality to the way we approach it. And I think I'll explain that best by just kind of walking through the science. Let's dig into ages, just looking at the time. We'll get lost in the detail a little bit. But So 2010, I'm going to go back to the paper from earlier. 2010, we basically published a piece that at the time we thought was kind of important. It's ended up being super helpful and really transformational for us and many organizations. And essentially what we did was, and this is something we do a lot, is we basically said, can we define a set of first principles for how to design learning? You know, starting with just basic memory formation in the brain. Can we build a set of first principles that are kind of a guidepost for everyone in learning to use, that generalizes across all types of learning? And it was about a year-long project. We worked with one of the leading memory labs in the world, headed by Leila Davachi at NYU and a number of other folks. And we basically did this kind of giant organizing thing of all the research out there on learning, And in particular, what we looked at is recall and easy recall. So you'll hear this a lot from us. There's sort of recognizing something after you've learned it. That's not so useful for most soft skills. There's kind of recall, easy, like recall is one thing, like recalling an idea, but easy recall is a whole next level. And then easy recall under pressure is a whole next level. And to learn something so you actually get easy recall under pressure is a whole different level of learning than like just recognizing something, And so it's really far up on that continuum. And I think a little bit about the sort of, the thing, I don't know what they're called, that when you whack a hammer down and the thing goes up at a fun fair, if you hit it really hard, you hit the bell, right? You got to hit it really
strongman.
Strongman thing, yeah. It's like that. You got to hit this, learning experience really hard for easy recall under pressure. And what we looked at with learning was like, what are the ingredients for easy recall under pressure? Like what does it take? And without getting too deep into the science, essentially it's the hippocampus is a fascinating network in the brain. It's really a network. It's in a location, but it's part of a memory network. And the hippocampus activates according to the strength of whether you'll remember something later. And that was a hypothesis for a long time. It's actually been tested and proven out in the last decade. So you can kind of try different activities and see how much the hippocampus activates. And it really does correlate with whether you remember something later. And so what we did was look at all the different research on what makes the hippocampus maximally activate and all the stuff. So we came to these 4 things. I gotta be careful I don't get lost in the science, but attention has to be really focused. And the irony of this is actually the less media, the more focused you can be. So you can be really distracted between chat and visual and words. And so in some ways, like just being on a phone bridge and hearing a really powerful story and having to focus means your attention's higher. Like not having pictures, but having to draw something that an instructor tells you to draw actually is really more attention than watching a slide, for example. So we have attention wrong. It's very close attention. We also need generation that is really making connections or generating connections between a new schema and your existing schema. So any new schema or concept that you're trying to learn, it has to link with existing schemas or concepts as adults. And that's the generation moment. That one's relatively intuitive, but people get attention wrong. Generation we sort of get in general learning principles. Emotions we get really wrong because everyone tries to make learning like lovely and nice and positive, and actually what you need is strong emotions for the hippocampus to tell the amygdala to tag this thing as important. So if there's no strong emotion somewhere, basically the amygdala doesn't get connected into the network, and you need that amygdala activation during an encoding task to actually have the hippocampus say, oh, this really matters. Let's really, remember this. And the challenge is negative emotions are much easier to kind of ramp up than positive. So you sort of got to be comfortable making people uncomfortable. In fact, we wrote about this. There was a piece in Fast Company a couple of years back. Maybe my team can dig it up and find it. We'll put it in the chat. But we wrote a lot about this, about, you have to be willing to actually make people a little uncomfortable, but maybe then bring them back. But emotions in some way need to be high for learning to actually stick. And then the one that people get really wrong is spacing. In fact, there's a lot of research about how wrong people get this, in that we do learn better if we learn in a block, if we only need short-term memory. So if we only need to remember something for a little while, then learning in a block can be beneficial. But if we need to actually remember something long-term or even mid-term, you actually must space the learning out. And it's weird, the more you space it out, the better. So people, kind of chunk learning together like a half day or a day, and they miss this massive benefit from spreading it apart. So anyway, that's enough on ages. This is our kind of foundational principle. And we essentially 7 years ago went back to the drawing board when a client said, we want you to train 5,000 people really fast. And we had no idea how to do that at the time. We want you to train 5,000 people really fast. Can you work out how to do that? And we went back to the science and we came up with this completely different way of delivering learning that now is the way we run our whole business around learning. So anyway, that's ages. Anything you want to add there, Catherine? We sort of dug in a bit, but any comments on ages sort of as as someone who's designing and delivering learning all the time?
No, I think you did a beautiful job explaining it. Looking forward to touching on that as we get into some case stories.
Yeah, we'll get into some questions, but let me whip through this. So let me give you some basic principles. I'm going to tell you 5 things companies do that make things worse, that make virtual learning worse, and then 5 things you can do to make it better. The first thing is people are keeping largely the same content but chopping it down. You know what you end up chopping down? The actual digestion activities and the stuff that really matters. And it's like taking all the nutrients out of food. And the other thing is virtually you do have less. It's a little bit harder to keep attention, although it's much easier if you do it regularly in short bursts. So it is true, you kind of want shorter, but if your brain says, well, we have a 4-hour classroom, we're going to need to make it 3 hours, that's not the way to think about it. You got like a 4-hour classroom, like what really matters in that classroom and how do we turn that into small bites? I'll talk more about that in a minute. People are still putting all the learning in 1 week, and I've heard this literally 50 times. If we have to do it in 1 week like we used to, because we will lose too many people. But they haven't done the actual math on what happens if you spread it out. Now, I did this recently. And I actually did the thought experiment really carefully, thoroughly. We haven't been able to collect hard data on it, but we did a serious thought experiment of basically taking a 3-hour workshop that you would do either virtually or in person, but just 3 hours back to back, and turning it into 3 50-minute Zoom sessions over 3 weeks. We call that a HIVE, high impact virtual experience, a kind of 3 virtual Zoom sessions, and roughly 20, 30 people in that area. But basically 3 hours in a block or 3 hours over 3 weeks, 1 hour a week. And we looked, there's a difference everywhere, but the really poignant data point was you're likely to get in the order of 6 times as many actions people will take if you spread it out. Literally 6 times as many actions people will take from whatever the learning is, just by kind of spreading it out that way. So obviously the other mistake is running, long sessions. You don't have 2 or 4 hours of actual attention. An hour is a heap for really focusing. They're not leveraging assignments between sessions is a huge opportunity, and only collecting NPS and general feedback. Those are mistakes. Let's talk about what to do differently, and then Catherine, maybe you can add some kind of color to this, and then we'll look at a case. But number 1, reduce your content to a small set of the essentials. Like, look at what really matters. Rather than trying to teach everything you would in person, say what really matters. What can we get the real return from? Secondly, focus on habits, not content. What habits do you want people to have, right? Whatever you're doing in soft skills, there are habits at the heart of it. And once you work out what those habits are, it's actually much, much easier to think. Giving away a lot of our secret sauce here, but think in terms of habits, not in terms of content. And when you do that, actually, you can actually reduce the content a lot once you know what the habit is, because it's much quicker to think about habits than it is content. Stretch things out. That's an obvious one. Make them 50 minutes each to keep attention, and do a really intense 50 minutes that people can't look away. Like really focus people's attention for 50 minutes on something, and then engage their network in between sessions. So Catherine, anything you want to share there, just from your experience, and then we'll look at a case.
Yeah, I'd actually like to share an example of a client that we were working with recently, who I think hit on almost every one of these 5 ways that virtual can be better, and also link that kind of back to ages like we were talking about. So we were working with a major luxury retail brand who had to close all of their stores, just shutter the stores because of COVID. And they have a learning event that they do every year in person. And so they were able to get about 35 people to this event, right? Because cost of travel, things like that. They recognized that the COVID environment gave them an opportunity to totally rethink the way that they would do this training event, the way that they would do this HR event, and worked with us to design a totally new agenda, a totally new way of doing this. So they actually used to have 2 days where they brought everyone in person, and it started at 8 o'clock in the morning and it went through almost 8 o'clock at night, really crammed things in. And we worked with them, we kind of broke that up. We said, we need to cut these sessions down. So 50, 55 minutes max. Start all of them with a really great engaging question. Ask people to connect with one another. Introduce yourself to someone in the chat that you've never met before. Ask them a question, get to know them. Say hi to your friends who you're seeing in the chat. Really get to that high relatedness, evoking emotions, things like that. They spread out the training. They looked to do a reconfigured slide deck. So they used to have a lot of text on their slides. And by just doing simple things like moving to more visuals or doing builds on slides, they were able to help with generation because your mind wants to fill in the blanks, right? So they were starting to make those connections. The most exciting part of working on this project had to be when we asked for feedback. And at the end of the very first day, participants were saying things like, this is refreshing, this is exciting. I feel like my voice is being heard. I feel like I'm able to be involved. This is so much more interactive than it's been before. And the thing is, it really was more interactive and it was more inclusive because they were able to have 250 people participate in a virtual event as compared to just 35 who could do in person. So they were able to create a more compelling, effective learning event and include more people in it.
Yeah, that's great. There's a lot more people, right? And that's one of the things we're finding. You can be far more inclusive with virtual learning. And so while there are downsides, of course, people would prefer to be in person. No question. We all love, it's easier. It actually feels nicer. There's all sorts of reasons we'd love to see each other. But in terms of actual effectiveness, virtual can be dramatically better. So you've got to be careful the question you ask. Like, do you like the training? No, people would rather be in a room. Have you built habits is the question, because it's a different world. So we're seeing, the learning can be faster, wider, more scalable, better habits, and more inclusive, all of those things. So I'll show you a data point and then we'll change gears. So 7 years ago, as I said, we changed our whole strategy on learning, and we essentially said, look, we're going to work out, and it took us really 7 years, we're going to work out how to not be a training company, workshop company, but a behavior change company. And we worked out this framework for measuring learning. And instead of using NPS, which is Net Promoter Score, we created our own framework called the behavior change percentage, that Catherine mentioned earlier. And it's literally the percentage of the target audience doing things differently now, activating your specific habit. And I'll show you a quick data point from Colgate. We ran 2 different solutions with them. One was Connect, which is our solution around just better conversations. And here we had 4,000 people in 70 countries go through an experience that is better than if we'd put a whole day workshop together, which they could never have done. In fact, they could have done the whole thing in 1 month, but they scaled it out over 11 months, but impacted 4,000 people. And what we know is that 95% of people were having more effective interactions at least once a week. Their interactions were better. Decide is our breaking bias solution. 89% are deliberately mitigating bias at least once a week. And again, that's 1,100. And we're actually doing a lot of work around bias, and we're impacting like 5,000, 10,000, these kinds of numbers in a month, and seeing the same kind of data that you can actually get people really mitigating bias every week. Most people really, really fast if you follow the science. But virtual learning is not new for us. As I said, we were 89% before the pandemic hit. So but the way we built it was not through technology. We're actually technology agnostic. We don't care what technology you have. It wasn't about that at all. It was about what are the habits people need? Moving backwards from there, what actions do they need to take to build that habit? Moving backwards from there, what insight do they need that will motivate them to take an action? And moving backwards from there, what's the ideal research and the ideal story that creates the strongest possible insight? So that's our whole kind of way of thinking about this. It starts with research and story to build insight, to get action, to build habit. And when you kind of pull it back from that way, actually now you can use all sorts of things, videos, podcasts, writing, just, tools that you give people. You can sort of really deconstruct the learning experience in all sorts of interesting ways. So I think let's pause there. We've been talking about radically improving all of learning. We're about halfway through. We'll spend less time than the others. Let's take some questions. Catherine, you've been looking through the chat. Anything you want to dig into?
Yeah, I've seen a couple questions come up about BCP and self-reporting. So I'd like to just address that by saying that BCP is self-reporting as well as an outside perspective. So we do have a survey that we send to participants that happens about 2 weeks after a training wraps. 2 weeks following that, we send out a survey to their direct reports or colleagues, folks who are interacting with them on a daily basis. And we ask them, how many times in the last week has your manager spoken to you about bias? How many times in the last week have you heard this language? Have you seen them shift the way that they make decisions? Have you seen them become more inclusive? So yes, we do self-reporting. That's really important. And what we found is that when you're asking about specific targeted actions, but the specific habits we're trying to drive, you get much more accurate results than, again, asking types of questions like, are you an inclusive person? Well, everyone's going to say they're an inclusive person, right? But people tend to be much more honest and much more self-reflective if you're asking things like, how many times in the last week have you used a strategy to mitigate bias? How many times in the last week have you talked to a colleague about bias? Then that additional report, the direct report or colleague report that we send out, we're really happy that I would say probably 98% of the time we see very similar results from what we're asking the coworkers and direct reports as we do in the self-reports.
Yeah, no, that's great. Glad you brought that up. The, self-report, you've always got to take with a little bit of a grain of salt, but the way we do it is not, are you inclusive or something? It's literally how many times in the last week did you do this? And there's research showing that kind of measurement is much more effective, but it's really the other people around them, their view that matters. And we're really looking at that as well. So, it's, Memory's asking a question, is, D&I training not more effective in person? Honestly, this may sound shocking. I don't know any soft skills training that's better in person. And the reason for that, if you don't need some technical thing there, and the reason for that is virtual learning done well is actually even more social. Like if you have, 20 people on a platform and everyone manages their light and sound, you can see everyone, hear everyone, you're literally seeing 20 faces. And when someone says something meaningful, you can see 20 heads nodding at once, right? And you can see 20 people drifting off when you start talking rubbish. Like it's so rich socially. It's actually more social than other ways. And in terms of, can you create really deep emotional experiences? Absolutely you can. Doesn't mean it will happen. You've got to manage some things, right? You've got to work harder, be more intentional with creating a safe environment and all sorts of things, and making sure people are mostly on camera and, be really kind. My daughter, my 17-year-old, started virtual learning some months back. And when it started, she was like, oh my gosh, I'm not going to be able to deal with this. It's going to be awful. And then after the first couple of sessions, she said to me, Dad, I can't believe it. Actually, it's really nice. My teachers are actually being almost like humans. Like we're seeing their pets and they're treating us as humans, and they're being really human and being really nice to us and asking us lots of questions. And I'm like, yeah, of course, the teachers are just freaked out about them just switching off and doing something else. So they're actually working hard to really engage them, right? And that's what the facilitator has to do in a virtual world, right? Really work hard to really engage people and not just talk at them. So it does put pressure on facilitators to do things better, for sure. But there's a whole kind of way to do that. There's a lot of practices you can do, using visuals, having everyone on camera and constantly using visuals. Give me a thumbs up if you're with me, thumbs sideways if you have a question, thumbs down if we've lost you completely, all sorts of things you can do. Anyway, so some good questions coming in. A couple of other things to comment on. Focusing on habits rather than content. It's a big conversation. If you're from an organization and, small, medium, large, whatever, but a few people will not like a tiny consulting, but if you're from an organization, we're happy to do what we call a free learning audit with you. And it'll come up in a poll and I'll show you a bit more in a minute, but a learning audit is basically, our consultants will review and researchers what you're doing in learning and basically give you a ton of feedback for free about how to do it better. So a free learning audit is something that we're doing. And if you kind of want to dig in more as to kind of what it looks like, you can just throw that in the chat and we'll dig in there further. So there's a lot to say. There's certainly a lot to say about that. Any other quick questions you want to answer, Catherine, or should we jump on?
No, let's go ahead.
Yeah, so we've talked a lot about kind of general learning, and let's talk a little bit more about leadership development, and just digging a little bit more into habits and kind of thinking about this, because leadership development, we think, is really a set of habits that leaders are applying. And general soft skills learning, you know, learning to communicate better, learning to actually have feedback conversations better, all of these are sort of, you know, can be built into a leadership program, but often leadership programs are, you know, very specific sets of habits you want leaders to activate in your organization. So we think in terms of priorities, habits, and systems. So we're a behavior change company, not a training company. We work across all three areas here. Maybe a normal consulting company works primarily in systems. A marketing company works in priorities. Almost no one except us works in habits. And we really put all three together. You know, how do you message things so they stick? How do you actually build skills and habits one at a time? And then how do you have the systems that support them? That's the way that we think. But priorities are just the beginning. You've really got to work on the habits. We have a strong hypothesis for how to build habits. And I guess this goes to someone's question earlier. You want to build the strongest possible insight for people. Insight changes the brain. You want to do that in social situations. So Catherine was mentioning our distributed learning solution is sort of 3 weeks of self-paced. It's not completely true. It's sort of self-paced, but the team, it's ideally in a team. The team like discusses in real time each week what they're learning, what they're applying, what they're doing. So it's actually social learning. And sometimes the team will actually watch the videos together. So it's 3 weeks of kind of content that's given to people, but ideally the team is actually working through that content at the same time. And then in the end, there's a synchronous hour that they come together. So we worked out how to do social in a scaled way. And then the big factor is one habit at a time over time. And that's really, really important. So we think of these as the minimum viable product. And I was talking to a literally rocket scientist recently at the government folks who you know, do all that. And I was saying, you know, if any of these are missing, the rocket doesn't leave the launch pad. You know, you can't miss any of these three things. You have to have strong insight for learning to work. It has to be social and it has to be one habit at a time. The social I'll dig into more. The reason for social, and we published on this in the last couple of years, it literally changes the memory network that's tapped in. So you encode more strongly, much more strongly, because you have all this social information that encodes automatically. And as a result, you recall more easily. And then the big one is you act more often. So when you're learning with your team, for example, you think your whole team is watching everything you're doing now, right? It's called the panopticon effect. Or if you learn with a cohort, right? You feel like you've got this responsibility to, you know, do the right thing. It's a strong motivation. And also thinking other people are doing something is the strongest motivation of all the different motivations they can find from social science. So it's such a powerful thing to be actually learning socially, ideally with an intact team or with a cohort that's going to be consistent for some time. When you add that element, you're dramatically increasing and you're literally achieving one of these three, you know, minimum viable products. And one of the fears we have with the sort of digital revolution is people are, you know, leaving out the social. They're also leaving out the one habit at a time. And you know, it's, you know, the digital can be intoxicating. It can be enticing. Like, wow, I can train 10,000 people for, you know, $1,000, you know, immediately. Anyone can access anytime. Are you actually building habits? And if you have some learning solutions and you want to actually test them, we're doing that now and then. It's not core business, but now and then we're coming in and actually researching and testing. Has your solution actually built habits? We did this a couple of years back for a consulting firm. Tax and audit and all that. They had this program they'd rolled out to like 1,000 people and they wanted it to go to another 5,000. It wasn't something we built. And I looked at it and said, and just kind of shook my head and said, look, you know, people might like this. I bet they love it. But it's not actually going to do anything. And they said, what do you mean? And I dug in and they said, can you actually collect data? You know, we're an accounting firm, show us the data. So we did this study and we collected data from quite a few people. I'm not going to give you totally accurate numbers. This is roughly about 2 or 3 people remembered anything at all. No one had any habits. a few months later. So it just, there was nothing sticking, but the Net Promoter Score was really high. People loved it and they thought other people should do it because they felt smarter. They had a great time, but it didn't actually create new habits. And that's one of the dangers with kind of NPS and all that. We do collect NPS as well because we think it's a piece of the pie, but we think you've got to really activate habits. And if you miss any of those three elements, it doesn't happen. I'm going to show you some crazy data, and then we'll take questions again. This is ridiculous. So basically, this is one of the world's only control group studies. It's just 3 data points from a study that's got many, many, many more data points. They're all consistent with this. HP Inc., we helped them reimagine what leaders should do. And basically we came down to leaders imagine the future, inspire the team, and make it happen, right? We simplified and radically kind of crystallized their whole approach to leadership. And it's more than just those 9 words, but that's the basic framework. Imagine the future, inspire the team, make it happen. And we then helped them roll out a solution that impacted all 50,000 people, building one habit at a time. The first data point is literally people whose boss, so this is not participants' feedback. This is the employees, the direct reports of participants who went through a learning experience. That was all virtual, by the way. So the first data point is people whose boss had not gone through this fully virtual learning experience. And the second data point is people whose boss had gone through this experience. And so look at the middle one. Does your manager make everyone feel valued? 52%, half versus basically everyone. So we were able to impact all 50,000 people in a pretty short time in a way that follows the science and have a radical impact on their leadership skills. And this is something that we do a lot of. So again, virtual. Who would have thought? We could give you a 3-hour lecture on the biases that are having us misread virtual learning. But the important thing is anchor on attention, generation, emotion, and spacing. And when you study something like your own learning experience, like you need all 4 conditions to be really high, to be high to very high for learning to stick. Any one of them isn't, you're not going to get easy recall under pressure. Right? Remember, we're not looking at, can people remember this vaguely? We're looking at easy recall under pressure. And it requires all 4 conditions of ages to be high. So you can actually assess your learning strategies against that, which is a really interesting thing to do. Catherine, anything you want to add? You're involved in like, over 100 of these. What do you want to add there?
Just to add on to this particular case study, I think one of the components that made this really interesting was these were leaders taking their teams through this training. So it was that nice blend, David, that you mentioned before of it's virtual. There are pieces of it that you can weave into your schedule easily, but it does allow for an interactive component. So one thing that we've seen a lot of is companies who have retail employees, who have manufacturing employees, public utilities who have employees out there, fixing the power lines. It's great to be able to have their manager I've seen it in as short as 15-minute meeting, deliver some of this content that still leads to that strong behavior change. So to your earlier point as well, it's tech agnostic and you can make it as high tech or as low tech as you need based on your audience. Of course, with that, focus on virtual, we're seeing lots of interesting ways now that we're getting virtual training out to those employees who used to be solely in person. And I'm really excited to be sharing more of that data at the summit as well.
Yeah, fantastic. So the key is don't think about content, think about insight generation, right? Think about insights that create habits, right? So as you're looking at any kind of human skills experience, you're trying to think about the habits and then think about the insights that will create those habits, right? Like, I'm going to give you an example. If you wanted a company to be healthier, right? If you wanted your whole company to be healthier, think about what are the habits that really have the biggest return. And if you just ask 20 people, you'll get 20 different things. But if you follow the science, you'll be able to work out the 3 things that have the biggest return. And the question is, how do you, it's an interesting question, how do you choose the ones that really matter? And it's, should be things that really generalize, impact everyone and really have a big, big return. But everyone tries to throw everything in and, we need nutrition and we need, breathing and we need, all those things are great. But if you only had 3 things, because humans have short attention spans, if you only had 3 things, what are the best 3? So how do you be essential, not exhaustive, right? And so we sort of think that way. And, from the health perspective, it's like one of them is going to be getting your sleep number, which is individual. Everyone has a different sleep number. But if you're getting your sleep number, your self-regulation is good, your digestion is good, your cortisol is good, your immune system is good, like all these things good. And then particularly in a difficult time, if you're not getting a sleep number, it really trips you into a downward spiral. So it's such an important thing, right? And so, that's one. So that's the habit, get your sleep number, not get 7 hours sleep, but get your sleep number, most nights, right? That's an example of a habit. And then what's the insight? The question is, what's the insight that will get people there? And, we've played with a few, and this is not something we directly teach, but, an example is, even an hour or two less sleep is like driving over the limit, right? And there's actually research on that you get an hour or two less sleep than your number, and the cognitive impairment is like you shouldn't be driving. It's literally at the level of, cognitive mistakes. So, when you really sit with that and think about that, it's like, wow, I really need to not just manage mine, but my teams and even my organization. But that insight, how do you get people to that insight? You actually want, to show them the data, but you also want to tell them a story. And it might be a story of the train driver in New York who accidentally killed a bunch of people, and why and how he hadn't been sleeping and no one cared about that. It's like story and science. And then like, wow, sleep really matters. It's like, it's as bad as being drunk, really. And not drunk, but, over the limit. And so you get that, and then it's like, what's the action that people are going to take? And then how, that's going to build a habit. So it's just thinking really differently, not about content, but about habits and insights. And then how you kind of create that. And you become, you start hiring script writers and storytellers and folks like that, because you need to think about the emotional experience, not just the science as well. There. Anything you want to add there, Catherine?
I want to just take the opportunity to kind of address one question that I've seen coming up in the chat, which is around how to leverage folks' networks in between sessions and keep things really social. So I know we're going to be getting into a bit of a conversation on large events. One thing that we've seen be really helpful is leaving Zoom links open or scheduling additional time in between sessions and offering things like guided meditation, offering things like coffee chats with discussion prompts provided, things like that. So there are lots of great ways to continue to leverage people's networks to help them build more connections. We've gotten a lot of really positive feedback from clients who've said, I really enjoyed doing this training with my team because it's given us something to focus on and do together that isn't related to COVID, that isn't related just to, the meat and potatoes of our jobs, that help us become better employees and better people. It's been really exciting to see all of that come up recently.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. And I'll spend a couple of minutes on the final one. We don't have as much, there's not so much science to share here, but I'll just share anecdotally some points in the last couple of minutes, but just a couple of quick questions to answer there. Firstly, don't do mandatory training. So we published a whole piece, Strategy and Business, a big piece on this. We should put that in the chat, particularly around diversity and inclusion. Literally a compulsory diversity and inclusion training can make your company more biased. Don't do it. Create something super compelling, and really working on the compelling part. And there's a whole way to think about that. That's really, really important to think about. The other thing is, someone's mentioning like manufacturing plants, other things, and computers. There's ways around all of that. And we've found we can scale the work infinitely different ways. Because it's really about just getting insights to people. So we've been able to work with serious manufacturers and people, mining companies, all sorts of things to work out the right way to actually get, these insights to people. Let's close with a couple of comments on events, and then we'll make some announcements, but stay with us. We've been in the large event business for a long time. We've run, I think 15 summits. In the early days, there were 400 or 500. Now there are about 1,000 people. So we've been running large in-person events for a long time, and also large virtual events for a long, long time. And because we have this theory and this way of delivering learning, we jumped onto large events really early on and started working with clients to reimagine, basically their large leadership retreat. And the first thing to say is, it won't be the same. So if you normally gather 200 leaders for 3 days and they drink and socialize and play golf and all this stuff, it's going to look completely differently. But actually, they can be net better. And the way they can be net better, similar to what we've talked about, is, take 2 weeks and do, Tuesday, Thursday, morning for an hour and a half, afternoon for an hour and a half, Tuesday, Thursday, as an example. And with the digestion time in between, and with people networking in between and connecting in small groups and all this stuff, you can have a vastly better experience architected, say, over 2 weeks than you would ever do in 3 days. Where the whole experience could be much more impactful, obviously radically cheaper, much more inclusive, and actually much more innovative, and particularly on the inclusive and innovative. So there's ways to think about large events where actually, if you used to spend $2 million, you're actually now going to spend like 100,000, and it'd be radically more effective and more inclusive. And that's, you don't even need to spend that, but, encourage you to think really differently. If you're interested in that, we're doing a lot of this work, mostly with large companies, but we've designed some amazing large events in the last 6 months, and they've been incredibly effective. Catherine, I think you're involved in a couple. Any comments you want to make there?
Yeah, I look forward to doing more, and just want to say that for all of these large events, we've done them on many different topics with many different industries, levels of employees. So this isn't just something that will work, only with top level leaders or only with frontline managers. You can really create compelling large events that would fit a variety of audiences.
Very, very senior ones. Yeah. One more quick comment, actually, one more question I want to answer, come up a few times. We've actually tested our unconscious bias solution. So we have an unconscious bias solution that is completely different in the market, because it actually gives people a language to mitigate bias every single week. And we actually did some data collection about a year ago. We'll do it again for our summit. It was about 9,500 different people across many, many different sites. We looked at, on average, how often are people mitigating bias each week, and it was 78%. So 78% of 9,500 people were now each week actually addressing bias in a way that was reducing bias. And that's what it's going to take to address bias. And, most of the work around bias is just about raising awareness. It does nothing. You actually need a common language in teams to call it out on each other in a safe way. So if you're new to our work in that space, dig in. Actually, just put unconscious bias in the chat now, and someone will follow up with you. But if you're new to our work there, I encourage you to have a look at that. It's a really, really important body of work at the moment. And it is actually possible to get a really, really, really big impact really quickly across your entire company. And we're doing a huge amount of that. A couple of announcements as we close. I think that's in the poll as well. So we've just thrown a poll up. A free learning audit, I mentioned. The NLI challenge, I'll explain in a moment. But also there's a bunch of things in here. Just would love you to click any of these things, any or all of these things, whatever's relevant to you, including the nothing for now, so we know not to follow up with you. But if you just throw in the chat kind of what you're interested in as a follow-up, I'll just walk through those. So the free learning audit I mentioned, that's where we actually walk with your learning team and our consultants and researchers, walk through what you're doing, and we give you free feedback and help you think about learning, because this world's going to be here for a while. The NLI challenge is a big idea. You actually tell us your whole budget for soft skills learning. We show you how to do it for like 25% less at least. It's a bold idea. If you're willing to kind of dig into that with us, we literally show you how to do all of learning that's radically better and a lot cheaper. So that's the NLI challenge. If you're interested in that. If you're from an organization we work with, please block your ears right now, but we're hiring, we're growing. We've actually had our biggest 6 months ever. We were already in the virtual business. We're already in the business of behavior change around, being better for humans and more diverse, all that stuff. So we have been growing like mad, and definitely hiring at all levels and in many, many, many locations. And we're super flexible on autonomy and where you work and all that stuff, always have been. The summit, we've mentioned it a lot. The summit is live. It's gone live about a week ago. It's a 3-day global kind of hackathon, ideathon to make organizations better for humans. Build a better normal is the theme. I'll give you a quick look at it, but summit.neuroleadership.com is the summary. Day 1 is a science day from the lab. We're actually going to take you really deep into the science, things like perspective taking, which we all need to be better at, equity, equality, and fairness, learning, obviously. Day 2 is kind of key priorities here, starting with build a better normal. And day 3 is all about from the field. So it's more kind of a bit more of a users conference flavor to day 3. If you're only going to come to 1, come to day 2. If you don't want to spend a cent, come to the opening keynote of each day. So we're giving away free the opening session of each day. So there's a big session that's literally the science of culture change, day 1. Day 2, it's build a better normal. Day 3, it's strategic diversity and inclusion. So there's a sort of first thing in the morning, US Eastern time, is a free keynote each day that will be super powerful. But the tickets are normally 2,000 or 3,000. It's under 500 now to get there. So have a look at that. I'll leave that up on screen. Oh, some of our people, I mean, it's Netflix and Zoom and Microsoft and some amazing scientists. We've got Soledad O'Brien, some amazing CHROs and CEOs, all sorts of people. So it's quite a rollout. Catherine, you've been involved in the summit. Anything you want to say about the summit before we wrap up, or any final insights today?
Yeah, I'm really excited. I think that this summit is going to be our best ever. And especially if you're interested in how do you make large events really work, I think that this is a great way to see some of that in action. Yeah,
that's great. We actually challenged ourselves to make this our best ever. And so far, fingers crossed, we never know till we do it each year, but so far we've, innovated in some amazing ways. The team's been incredible, and it's going to be quite a connected and global, experience. So you're going to hear case studies from around the world and experiences from around the world as well. So thanks everyone for being here. Hopefully we've given you some insights, right? If you're animated and excited about something, you've probably had a level 4 insight. Hopefully we've given you some insights about thinking differently. Please let us help you any way we can. Gabe, thanks so much for you and everyone else on the team, the hard work behind the scenes. Catherine, thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule to be here with us. I'm glad to have you in front of the scene rather than just always behind the scene. Great to have you with us and your fantastic insights. And over to you. Take care of yourselves, look after each other, and keep delivering what matters. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.